Yeah. It says we're live, but it takes a minute to actually get us live on
Gotcha.
Facebook. So,
And you can hear me okay?
Mhm.
Okay.
Got all the kids squared away, taken out of your house.
I just closed doors and moved them. Yeah.
There you go. All right. We are just about ready. I'm gonna says we're live. Here. There we go. All right. So welcome back to Cultivating Connections in the Time of COVID. I'm Amanda Brozana-Rios, the Communications Director for National Grange. Today, I am joined by a powerhouse in our rural education sphere, and that is Alan Pratt with the National Rural Education Association. Hey, Alan, how are you?
Hey, great. Thanks for having me on. This is a pleasure to connect.
Absolutely. You have been everywhere. You and Alan Morgan from National Rural Health, I think, are the two busiest men outside of our own National Grange Legislative Director, Bert Eller, that I know right now, because everybody seems to realize that rural is in some real desperate times.
Yeah, and a matter of fact, Alan, the other Alan, I would say, he and I have been on some podcasts together. So yeah, we've been in a lot of places in the same location and in virtually as well. Yeah, rural is been at the forefront pretty strongly during this. I guess I can still consider this the first quarter kind of initial phase of this pandemic. And what's brought to light has been the fact that we have connectivity issues, we have broadband issues, and we have some inequities that have kind of really jumped to the forefront with us sheltering in place or being at home and educating from the home. And so it's really brought that to the forefront.
I think I want to start with rural connectivity because, of course, we all know that that's kind of where the Grange has been a huge voice for a decade and a half.
Yeah.
But I do want to hit some of those other inequities in a little bit. So from your perspective, I mean, we've been hammering this drum, all of us, your organization, ours, Rural Health, everybody, about rural connectivity. But how has this crisis brought that issue even more to the forefront? And do we thank this disease or do we curse it for what's going to happen next in rural education?
I think anytime you have issues or I guess trying times, you're going to see what we call the true grit of people or of our society, of what comes out of this. So we'll look at it from not praising the disease, but maybe praising what's going to come out of this as we find out that, maybe it is in our country's best interest that everyone is connected and every zip code has the same connection. Maybe that is the best interest for us, national security wise, just communication wise, but especially educating children. And rural areas, rural schools and communities are really innovative, and they're really do a lot with their budgets. Imagine what they could do if everyone could be connected at home, and each little rural area of the town would be connected. So I think we look at it as a positive in trying to find a way to make this happen. I will caution people in a certain area, and this, if they funded everything tomorrow and said we're going to go forward, we still wouldn't be every area connected by August or September. So we're going to need to find those fixes, or those, this is a bad way to put it, but a Band-Aid, so to speak, on some of those areas until we get to the point where we're connected. So, and that comes from cellular connectivity, wireless, and also hardwire or broadband itself. So,
when we had the chairman, FCC Chairman Pai, on a week and a half ago or so, we talked a lot about connectivity, obviously, and the fact that this is spotlighting this rural need, especially when it comes to education. We talked about some of the things that are cropping up as those Band-Aids. So I know that some of these even more than we have heard of them. What are some ways that you're seeing communities respond to make sure that children are able to be educated at this time by getting them connected, besides what the big telecoms are doing, and thankfully for them?
oh yeah,
For
definitely.
making promises to keep us connected.
And I think that is a good way to start when you're looking at the telecoms for coming through and offering discounted prices and or free prices until the end of the school year. I think those are definitely band-aid fixes, but you also have areas that don't have any connection or that cell service or cell signal. I know there's a place in Tennessee, probably about a 2-hour drive from me, probably less than that actually, that there's zero cell signal. So to have a hotspot or something is not going to help those students. So their schools are putting and really the local electric co-ops are doing the internet kind of the, I guess what we call drive up service. So they're doing those hubs either on a bus or on a certain location. We've seen schools that have really opened the parking lot up and marked the parking lot so students could pull up and do social distancing, monitoring that no one's getting out of the car, but to download assignments, work at assignments. I've seen schools with flash drives, using flash drives to kind of share the information, uh, mailing packets, using the packets. So you name it, A to Z, it's gone on. And rural schools have done a great job. The teachers, the principals, and we'll give a shout out to our cafeteria workers in those rural schools that are doing the feeding programs, and they're really on the front line. It's amazing what's going on with the food service providers at each of these schools.
Absolutely. We have our state president in Idaho is manages a food service for a school, and the incredible work that I know that she's doing right now, and I can just imagine that all of her counterparts across the country are. You don't know what it means to feed people until you feed people in their homes, in their communities in this way. It's really incredible.
And it's
Um,
ma- it's a, I mean to interrupt you. I
yeah.
apologize. It's amazing to see the numbers they're feeding. And I think when we share those on social media or people are sharing on Facebook or Twitter or whatever it may be, the numbers need to be shared because it really puts a sense of there's a lot of folks in need in these rural schools and rural communities. And it's amazing what's going on.
Yeah. So I think about that in terms of budget because, of course, they were going to feed these students these meals anyway. But typically, of course, there was going to be some money back because any student who isn't qualified for the free and reduced lunch is paying probably between $1.75 and $3, $4 for a lunch, some money for a breakfast, depending on where the school is located and how much those things are priced. And now these feeding programs are happening almost as a blanket for all of
Yeah.
the rural districts. What does that mean in terms of budgets? And I want to stick with budgets there for a minute too, but let me start with that.
So I think there's a lot of flexibility coming out from the USDA that's really helped the school districts out a lot. And I want to give a shout out to Secretary Perdue because I do think they're trying to do the right thing and help out. So I think that's been a positive, and I think there's been the reimbursement aspect of that has been good for rural districts as well. Um, you talk about budgets in general on the feeding program or whatever it may be. I think that we really don't know where we're going to be because of lost tax revenue, obviously, state to state, especially even with the CARES Act money that came down, that's going to come down to the districts. We don't know where we're going to be, and I think there's an estimate of what money you're going to receive from the feds through the CARES Act, but what money and how it's going to be, how your budget's going to look next year. That's one of those things I think you probably need to brace for not a strong budget. I know local districts around here have already kind of finalized their budgets on cutting back on some of the areas they thought they could add. One of them locally was a teacher raise, and they just couldn't do it. So I think that, those are going to be difficult decisions moving forward. Going to be difficult decisions on hiring and or filling needed or openings in schools as well, which goes right into the budget as well. So
I know when I was a reporter, one of the biggest areas in school budgets for our rural districts was transportation because you were putting kids on buses from all over the countryside, for
yeah,
hundreds of square miles in some cases. And those contracts obviously aren't, they're in place for a year. They're probably not having to pay them in full, but those bus companies are hurting. The the budget itself is now going to be hurting. And if we go back to school, we hope, I guess, like normal in the fall, it's almost, I almost don't understand how those budgets are going to work out. I'm wondering what you're hearing from some of the administrators. And I know you previously were an administrator in school districts. So I'm wondering what you're thinking as far as the overall budget pictures.
Well, if you talk about transportation in general, let's go with the first part of it. And I think it goes to districts that own their buses or they contract, like you talked about. And I think if you're a contracted services with the buses, you're probably working out some kind of negotiated deal that you're still paying something because there is a contract. But I do think the contract's going to look different when we move into the fall because we don't know what's going to happen. And if there's a outbreak and a second outbreak, then what do we do if we're sent home and there's no buses? So I think that's going to be a part of it. I also think you look at fuel prices, diesel prices, that's obviously changed and fluctuated a lot. I know we in the past, the county system I worked in, we budgeted a range. So if it didn't go too high or too low, so I know that's in play. I think the districts that own their buses, I think they've used them wisely with the Wi-Fi and delivering food. So all that comes into play. And I think for, this year's budget year, the buses were pretty much paid for in a sense. They were budgeted, so they're going to use them to the best of their ability during this time. The rest of the budget, it really depends on the flexibility that the feds have given local state government, and then how that's moved or pushed down to the district level. Tennessee's the state that's reopening, so we are reopened. Georgia reopened last week, and Georgia announced today that their schools won't start until after Labor Day. So I think Tennessee will be similar in that approach as well. I think if the number of people out is an indication of the tax base and maybe some funding and spending, that's probably a good sign. I'm not saying everyone should be out. We still be practicing our safety and all that, but maybe that's a good sign that we're moving kind of back towards some sense of normalcy. It's just really tough on the budget. I know as an organization, we're worried about budget because our school districts that are members of our association, if they get budget crunched, it could hurt our association as well. So we've done the same thing as everyone else, kind of put a spending freeze on some extra items or things we're doing. And fortunately, we were in a good space before this hit, and we're riding it out. But I do think you could see districts in trouble budget wise later on down the road. You could see some forced consolidation or some consolidation things pop up again simply because of budget and monetary issues. It's like 08, 09, the recession back then. Sometimes districts didn't see the full effect or impact of that until 2010, 2011. That's our fear when we look at this is, okay, we'll have some money to go forward with. I was talking to a district in West Tennessee, a small district, they're going to get about $800,000 from the CARES Act funding. Well, that's a lot of money to a district that the budget's pretty tight, we're pretty small. That could push them along for a while, but 3 years down the road, that's where we're looking at maybe if we don't recover or the economy does take a nosedive, then what are they going to be? So.
You hit the big C word. I think that's going to kind of swing into this, and I hate to hit a question almost twice, but before we leave the transportation realm, one of the questions that we had from a member who is concerned about when they do start sending kids back is how you have, because they do live far away and said they don't have anybody in their family who would be able to transport their kid to school, so they're going to have to take the bus. How do you have 6 feet apart? And I mean, I was thinking about that when they asked that, because you want to just say, well, 1 kid per seat, but those seats are so small that you're going to have multiple buses compared to 1 bus on a run if you have to have those kids bused. And then it goes to that consolidation thing. If you end up with districts that have to consolidate, you have even further to transport the kids. And this is you're a rural organization, we're a rural organization. We understand that transport is a big deal.
Yeah. I think and it gets, you brought up a great point. There could be multiple routes. So to get those numbers, or the 6 feet apart, or the mask, or whatever it may be, there may have to be more than one route in a normal area, which could increase your cost, and which will increase your cost and your travel budget. I think the positive of everything right now is that when states start to reopen, school districts are seeing the good things that are going on and how people prepare, and the bad things, meaning the lack of preparation in certain areas.
Right.
And I think that's a lesson learned, and I think they can pull from this over, May into the summer, and say, okay, we now understand these things are working. This is not. So that'll be in our plan of when we reopen, how we reopen, how we clean our schools, how do we deal with someone that has symptoms of something, and how do we quarantine or send them home for 14 days. I think with that budget, you're looking at technology or other ways to educate. I think those are all in play as well. But yeah, you hit a good, I mean, transportation is, especially for rural remote districts, it's a major process, and it's a major part of your budget. And I'm sure that's in the topics of budget meetings right now with school boards, of what happens if, and I think they have to be ready.
I just actually heard from our, so you'll notice that I'll be taking questions and fielding things as we do this. I just heard from our food service director, our state president in Idaho, who's the food service director in her district. And she said they're actually feeding everybody 1 through 18 in their communities under the summer feeding program.
Yeah.
That's not what districts budgeted for either, is it? Or is that all covered under the USDA feeding program guidelines that are?
I'm not an expert on that one, but I will say I think the USDA has the program, and I think there is some coverage there. I do know there's Meals to You is a program, it's a partnership that the USDA, it's a private partnership with a group out of Texas, and I think PepsiCo is involved in that as well. And they actually ship the food to the person's house if the district qualifies or the area qualifies. So I know those are going to be going on. But you're right, there's going to be a major increase throughout the summer. I know the community I live in, the small local community I live in, they've done summer feeding since I was principal and everything else. So we were kind of accustomed to that process of pickup, or how they would do it 2 or 3 days a week. So, but it's going to put a little strain on the district folks.
Absolutely. So we mentioned other inequities, because connectivity isn't the only one. And I mean, we kind of got off on our tangent already a little bit that's covered some of these things, but there were other inequities that you guys were really trying to bring to the forefront well prior to COVID, just like us, with rural education, rural health, rural everything. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what were some of the issues that you had kind of on the chalkboard to make sure to raise awareness about this year, and where they are now.
Well, I think always we look at budget issues or funding issues, but one is teacher shortage, teacher pipeline, the hard to fill staff areas, and we need more teachers, high quality teachers, especially in STEM areas in our rural schools. That's going to be we're going to see that as an issue as we move forward. One of the things out of this, we may not see teacher movement as much because we've been locked down and teaching from home. There may not be as much teacher movement this year, but we know that's going to be an issue as we move forward. That's the biggest, those technology, teacher shortage, always funding issues. Those 3 are really the big ones. We look at access to high quality programs. So when I look at inequities in that area, maybe some AP courses or other courses that they just simply don't have the staff to do, which comes back to the connectivity, or it may be devices, it may be equipment in general. So all those kind of factor into that inequity that we talk about in rural areas.
You mentioned the teacher and staff shortage, and that's something I think that's really important to discuss. And I think one other part is the disruption of the pipeline, because in many states, and of course every state is a little different in what way they do teacher licensing. basically, or teacher certification, depending on what state it is. But some of these teachers who were leaving programs who still needed to do an in-class type learning that might have started it in February and been disrupted by March, they don't have enough hours under their belt. I'm wondering if it's going to be like Georgia, where they said every 16-year-old who has a permit can get their license. We don't even need them to come do a test, or if it's going to be where these teachers are bounced back a year. So a district might have thought they had someone in place or could have had someone in place, and now that pipeline is totally disrupted.
Yeah, I think a lot of their state board of eds have met during this time, and they kind of waived certain aspects of that. So I know at the university where my office is, we folks that are doing student teaching now this semester, they're not going to be held up or not able to receive a license. So I think that's a positive. I think it's a temporary stay, but you made up a good point here. If we go into the fall and we hit it again, a lot of our programs, I know at UTC, it's a year-long residency program, so that year has to be tracked. And you're right, the hours, and they have to pass the EdTPA to make sure they get their certification. So I think those things are going to have to be year to year looked at, maybe a waiver or a kind of a phasing in and out of the program to help us out during this time period. It doesn't, you're right, there's a pipeline stop, but also we already had a slow trickle anyway. It's just rural areas. So anytime we slow it or stop it, that trickle's obviously going to be impacted more at the end. So I think we're going to be battling this issue as we move forward. And we know funding, we're not going to get a raise probably in a lot of these states for teachers. And we've seen that locally here as well.
And I'll tell you that I worry. I have a massive amount of student loan debt, so I'm always paying attention to information about student loan programs, things like that. And I know in a lot of the rural districts, some of the things that they've been doing to innovate, to make rural teaching more attractive, is to hook these teachers up with programs that allow student loan forgiveness and things. But that requires so many contact hours, and I just always think that, boy, things are going to get more complicated than they need to be, but really there are certain requirements that are going to just not be met.
Yeah. And I think you're right. I mean, I think there's certain requirements that by law have to happen. We're obviously going to waive some of those to begin with here to get things going, but what's it going to look like in 2 years when you're going back and say, oh, you're not grandfathered in, sorry, this is going to change. So I think that's a big part. You did bring up a good point about the kind of loan forgiveness portion for incentives to teachers. Some states are doing that, and it was going fairly well. I wonder how that's going to be impacted as we move forward during this time. I mean, that could hurt those programs. Another aspect, I was on a call Monday, and a lot of students that would go into maybe move to another campus, move to another city to go to college, especially from rural Appalachian area, they're not wanting to go. So maybe there's going to be more students stay around and go to the local universities, and that in turn could help the rural teaching pipeline in those areas. That may be what we see more of the regional universities, trade schools, community colleges that are near folks that they're kind of worried about traveling this next semester. Maybe they stay closer to home.
Yeah, I've seen that there's a lot of students who are considering gap years, or considering staying close to home, or at least living at home, that had not before. So it sounds like, there's a lot of kind of market pressure in different ways, if you want to call it that. I'm wondering about something else that's kind of a market pressure area, and that's the idea of homeschooling. We're all homeschooling right now, but we're not. We're just schooling in place. Mm-hmm. We're not being asked to develop curriculum. We're not being asked to make sure that it meets the state guidelines. We're not truly homeschooling, but it seems like there's going to be a lot of parents who either are concerned about sending their kids back to a mass public education setting, or may have decided that they, for some reason, can provide education that they prefer to their kids. So what do you see as happening there?
Good. I'm glad you brought it up. I had a call last week with about 5 rural superintendents, and that was the question that just came up on what happens if we have a certain number of our population that says we're not sending them to campus. So I think these districts have to find an alternative that they can still pull state dollars and be able to make it work. And it may be some kind of online academy that they work in conjunction with their regular K-12 environment. I think that's the ones that do some type of hybrid approaches are the ones that are going to do really well. I think if you don't have a plan and you're sitting there and folks can say, I'm going to stay at home and I'm going to do a homeschool option, you could lose some enrollment. And I definitely see it as a safety factor. Before this call, I had to run a couple of errands and do a couple of things. And I was just happened to count the number of masks people were wearing and where I was. And it was today seemed like a larger number than yesterday. And you wonder why, but I think that concern of if they said we're going to open school tomorrow, I don't think you'd have 100% attendance. You might have 50% attendance. So I do think that's going to be issues that are going to pop up.
And of course, districts have to meet a minimum requirement of teachers or staff in a building that can be there to supervise the number of kids that are in a setting. I mean, that's not just can you teach science today, our normal music teacher, but that is population control, really, in some ways. And so if there's concern about whether or not there's going to be enough teachers and staff who can show up to do the job, this could be a school day by day.
Yeah, and I think it's region by region too. If you had an area, and I'll use say Nashville, that had a spike again, you're definitely going to have some teacher shortages. And I think that's where districts have to have that hybrid plan where they can almost shift it off and on to say, okay, since we had a spike, Thursday, Friday, Monday, Tuesday are going to be hybrid at home days. We'll be back on Wednesday. I think those shifts are going to have to take place. We've shown to some degree that we can shift rapidly and do things a little bit differently. Making it perfect and better is going to be the goal for the fall. But I think that's going to have to, I think we're going to get to the point where we won't have snow days anymore. We'll get to the point where we'll have these hybrid days where you stay at home, but learning's still going on. I know some of the urban, but a lot of the suburban areas of our country are already in that world for the most part. I think that's another benefit of being all connected in the rural areas, that those options could take place. And I think that's important.
So I guess that leads me into, how does this change the way that we see education in the future? And is it yet another place where rural gets left behind?
See, I think there's two pivot points there. Number one is the connectivity issue with we're not on an even playing field, so that we could be left behind. But the other pivot point would be, I think it's innovation of who says we have to go to school 8 to 3 every day. And I think that the innovative part of do we need a child to be there 7 hours, 8 hours, or could the child be there for 4, go home and finish up what else they're doing, and have a rotating like a Monday, Tuesday, where some come on Monday, some come on Tuesday, and they rotate it out. I think that's going to change in education. I think the aspect of training for jobs and that workforce development is going to change through this as well. I think we'll be more focused in on this is what you need to do to fill the regional workforce needs. I think that's going to change. I think I think there's positives coming out of it. We need to be more flexible. We need to be more adaptable, and we need to do things better. And it's not that we weren't doing it great right now. There's some good things going on in schools, but I think it shows us that we do need to kind of be more flexible and be able to meet the needs of every child.
And I just wonder, I mean, again, I ask these questions without having kids in my home. So I know I feel a little like I may not be hitting the high points, but I feel like I'm looking in from outside and wondering, will the schools change faster than our workforce does? Because, for example, I have a colleague with 4 boys in school. She's talked, pretty consistently about it is a struggle to sometimes make sure they're on task because they're 5 to 13, have the devices and the support they need, because normally they'd ask the teacher the question, they have to be asking her the question for her to be able to get her job done in a timely fashion. And we're fortunate, that she can do her job at 8 o'clock at night if she really needs to for certain pieces, and just have certain meetings throughout the day at specific times. But I know that jobs aren't out there like that all over the place. So do you see problems with the adaptation happening possibly faster than the workforce can allow it? Because right now, I don't know how sustainable this model currently is.
Oh, I don't think you're right. What we're doing currently probably is not sustainable, but I think more of a blended hybrid approach is. And I think if you had a school day where it may not be 8 to 3, it may be an 8 to 12. I think people can adjust their schedules, and I do think that our manufacturing jobs or our jobs in general, they'll have to shift as well. And I'm pretty positive. I think both can shift, and I think they can make it work because we're talking about people's livelihood. I think people will make it work. We do know there's going to be cases where people just don't have an option, and they're going to have to make tough choices. That's an inequity. That's an issue that we know could happen in some rural communities. We don't need that to happen, and that's where I think the school and that person to person, face to face, still has to be there. And I think that's where we've got to kind of regionally or each area solve those problems as they come about, because they don't have the answers right now because we just don't know what we're getting into. But I think the ability to be flexible enough to shift it back and forth, that's a starting point. And after that, we're going to have to weave and find our way. There's not an answer for that right now. That's going to be difficult. I don't think it's a total shift to online learning though. If you did that across the country, you're right. We're going to have some parents going crazy. We're going to have a lot of kids by themselves, which could be tough.
Yeah. And I think you're going to have a lot of people. I mean, if this would be an extended period, say, I can't do that.
Yeah.
I just financially, economically, enjoyment, quality of life. I don't want to give it up to only being with my child all the time,
Yeah.
So I think because we're a community-based group, our members are volunteers and things, there are always ways that they're looking to meet community needs. And I think that this is one area where knowing what your school is doing and knowing what that means for the parents in your district who are still caught in this in between before industry makes the shift and before there's more flexibility in place, may be a good place for our community groups to step in and provide resources.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think that's where a rural district has an advantage a lot of times because they're the hub of that rural community. I think communication from the district to the parents is going to be at the highest level. You have to have the transparency of this is what we're doing. This is our schedule. This is how it's going to work. And I think input from the parent side and not just being from the school side saying this is what we're doing. I think that needs to happen on both ends to answer some of those questions. I think there's probably focus or groups in the community like you were talking about that can help. It kind of reminds me, I did a almost 2-month work kind of study, I guess an intern in Argentina, and a lot of their schools, they don't go to school 8 to 3. So they had a group come in at 8 to 12 or 8 to 10:30, and then a group come in after lunch. It was pretty intriguing to see that model. And I think that's when we talk about this hybrid, blended, different approach, staggered schedule. I think some of those are going to be in play. And you see where students that come in the morning, they would go do their club sports or work afterwards or vice versa. And the parents kind of had that adjusted as well. I think that may be what we're looking at, a lens of how we're moving forward. And some of our trade schools or vocational programs may look totally different as well. So
it's really going to be a different world. I think that no one 6 weeks ago or 8 weeks ago thought that we were going to see such changes across so many facets of our life. Because while that may not impact my direct life, it will certainly impact the way in which I talk and communicate with other staff members or expectations of our volunteer leadership and our volunteer membership on us and us on them. And that's just, again, from my perspective, every person who's dealing with people who have someone connected as a teacher, an administrator, or a student in a school is going to be impacted, long term by the way this shifts.
Yeah. It's definitely going to be a different world. I kind of, it'll be interesting to look back in 3 years and see how we've changed, and try to find that moment or that pivot where we said, this is exactly what we needed to do. And it's changed us for the better. So I'm kind of looking forward to those moments. I'm looking forward to a lot of moments that are going to be better, but those are kind of some of the things that we know are going to change.
So I want to ask you kind of two connected questions yet. I want to also remind anybody who's watching that if you have questions or comments, please put them in our Facebook comments here, and I will make sure to ask them to Alan. You can text them to me or message them quickly. But the two kind of combined questions here are, what are some of the priority issue areas that you're going to be continuing to work that just don't go away? They may be amplified, or they may just be a standard thing. And how does your organization work? Because I know you have membership as well. So who's a member, and how do they help with those type of priority issue areas?
So, we'll talk with the membership base. We have members in all 50 states, and we have university and college members as well, teachers, principals, administrators, school board members, other associations. We have 42 state affiliates. And then we have, some kind of what we're working on, emerging state affiliates that we're trying to work during this. It's kind of opened some areas up for us during this time. Our membership base is involved with our teams, and we do a national conference every year as well that, we highlight what's going on in rural areas and the positives of what's going on and how we're changing. But right now, I think the focus is on the priorities of making sure that rural America, at this pivotal time, that we show that we are heading in the right direction. And what I mean by that is our focus needs to be on, if we don't have connectivity or we don't have that taken care of, then we're pushing for that area. We're pushing in DC right now on our state level, funding issues, funding equity, funding formulas that are going to give us a fighting chance to make it. And I think those are big as well. We're also really becoming a part of, and our membership is as well, looking at how we connect the K-12 world to jobs and to higher ed, but also post-secondary. And I think we've been there before, but I think even more now, we need to make sure we're focusing in on how we make those connections, those opportunities for students. We're also through this looking at how we look at online learning, blended learning, and hybrid approach on how we do school in general. And the other part of this has been really, it's kind of, I didn't think I'd talk about this much, but the USDA part of this and how it's impacting schools, but the food service, and how much I've become more versed at that world than I was in the past, simply because it's become such a forefront issue for us. And that's going to carry forward. Not that it wasn't before, but it wasn't in the forefront, say, as the other educational funding, the title programs or SPED funding, special ed funding that it is now. So that's our push, and coming up with ways that we can connect with our members and our legislators to hear what's going on, hear our issues. One of the things we've done is we started a rural podcast, and it's really been good. And I think we've up, I guess they say drop. I could connect my producer person there, 12 episodes, and we're working on to get to 20. And so that's been really interesting. It's really changed since we started. And from episode 5 to now, it's been really a COVID push and how we're responding and reacting to what's going on. I might have went too long there, but that's yeah.
I just have to mention that I noticed you have launched a campaign called "I Am a Rural Teacher."
Yeah, we have with the Rural Schools Collaborative. Gary Funk is the director of the Rural Schools Collaborative, and we have a team that works with a lot of it's grant funded through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Has funded this, and excuse me, it started off telling rural teacher stories about where you're from and what it's like to be a rural teacher, and of course shifted into this COVID response and what we're doing. And it's really kind of the numbers of interaction is really skyrocketed in the last 3 weeks. I think they uploaded today before I came on about 7 or 8 different stories from Nebraska. I know Wisconsin, Indiana, Texas, California. So it's been really good to see those stories. And on our website and their website, and of course on Facebook, I'm a Rural Teacher. Please like that page, and the folks doing the work with social media and those stories do an amazing job. And it's been really good for us to kind of hear those stories. And we feature a state every week. So this week coming up is going to be New York. And so we're going to highlight New York rural schools and New York rural areas. So it's pretty interesting. We've got 50 states in 50 weeks. So we're getting close. We're moving pretty rapidly. And I think last week was Nevada, and then we did Nebraska the week before. So it's been good.
Yeah, I definitely would recommend anybody to check that I Am a Rural Teacher out on social media. The campaign is really interesting. I think we have a ton of people who are in education who are in the Grange, either teachers, administrators, folks who work in food service, who work in custodial staffs, who work in transportation. You name it, we've got lots of Grange members out there doing it. And so I think you'll find it kind of reflects who you are, and maybe something where you can offer your story as well. But more than that, I think, checking out National Rural Education Association, Alan's organization, I think is important because we are so vastly rural and offer, a great service to our membership and to rural communities. But you guys are very strictly education based. And so I think that's a great organization for you guys also to check out. So just give a good plug for you, Alan.
Hey, thank you. We need it. And man, this has been great for me to connect and see another human, so
You most days.
family, right? Other than my family. So no, it's good. It's and I do want to, the amazing amount of work that's going on with custodial staffs and our cafeteria workers, food service providers. It's amazing. It really is amazing what's going on. So that's my shout out. I feel like they're kind of underserved in a way, and they're not getting the highlight. I'm not taking it away from teachers, nurses, doctors, but those folks are doing it every day with not a lot of fanfare.
Yeah, absolutely. Folks who are driving those buses out that are actually giant Wi-Fi connections and sitting them in rural communities. I saw something about one of the bus drivers offering to read to kids, the little kids who are not the school age ones, while others were around the bus, connecting. I thought that was just such a neat service. You wouldn't have. Who would think?
Yeah, people are looking for ways to give back, and I think communities, it just find your niche and go and just do something for someone, and I think that's what we're good at doing in rural communities, taking care of each other. And you see it every day. You see what's going on. So it's really uplifting to see those stories. And if you have a good story about your school, share it on I'm a Rural Teacher. We have a forum online. Share it, because we'll post it and tell your story.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Alan, for joining us. I really appreciate it. I am looking forward to seeing where education goes in the next couple months. I'm looking forward to seeing what's happening with the schools and how many of them are, going to make some hard decisions about opening or closing. And I can imagine that we might have you back on here talking about some of those decisions and what it means for schools and parents and everyone else coming up. So I really appreciate your time.
Hey, thank you. It's a pleasure, and appreciate you reaching out to us.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys, for joining us. Don't forget that we are on here again tomorrow with David Watson, who will be talking about finances in the time of COVID. So kind of a crazy topic as well. We are hitting you with everything this week. And then our introduction to ASL and deaf culture continues on Friday at 4:30. So make sure to brush up and stretch your hands after you wash them. Stay
There you
safe.
go.